Hey folks, welcome back to the podcast. This episode today, we really struggled to think of the right title for it, because despite how long or short some episodes might seem, we're often faced with the impossible task of fitting decades of experience, knowledge, and to be honest, wisdom from our guests into like 1 or 2 hours of conversation. We have this thing about framing people, about giving them a name or a title or a role, and that unconsciously puts a lot of unspoken limitations on how much you can really take from that person as a coach or a mentor, or just someone to kind of help guide you through your own career. So my guest today is Carl Boasman. Now, after 31 years service, retiring in October 23, Carl started doing a lot of leadership development, a lot of coaching, mentoring, but his career started joining back in 92 with North Yorkshire, and he served every operational role up to area manager. He undertook a wide variety of operational, specialist and managerial roles, including training instructor, development centre manager, communications and district manager. He led the introduction of fire behaviour training and spent a lot of time in Sweden, gaining the European fire behaviour training instructor qualification. Then moving into that group manager role, he did several geographical areas and fire stations before moving into specialist roles in HR, health and safety, occupational health, operational assurance. Then in 2016, he was appointed to an area manager where he had that kind of strategic look on the organisation. He was part of the services corporate management board, getting involved for the first time in a lot of gold level incident command. And Carl now teaches and assesses all the way up to kind of senior leadership and gold level. That's where he got a lot of experience around organisational development, having that long lens, getting stuck into industrial relations, negotiation, dispute resolutions, all those really difficult, tough conversations. And in 2020, he was appointed Assistant Chief Fire Officer and Director of Community Protection with a strategic level responsibility for operations as well. He's done a lot of work with local resilience forums, TCGs. He ran one of these during the COVID pandemic for around 18 months, looking at that response all the way to the recovery. One thing I really found interesting as well was the conversation around cultural change. He actually developed and led a cultural change program to improve workplace health and safety, and led on a lot of the national level work for equality, diversity and inclusion as part of the NFCC. But again, when you start looking at those senior level leaders, you forget about their 30 plus years of career and the fact that many of them have been in those sticky situations themselves. Carl reflects on a really emotive incident where he had to make the decision for him and a colleague to don BA sets and try to carry out a subsurface rescue, something that for us, as we are now with our guidance, rules and procedures, would just seem crazy, surely. But it was a different time. And commanders back then were still faced with these impossible challenges, these really wicked problems, where time is on the line and the public pressure is just huge. So today we speak about things like the impact you have on the people around you, on your team, on the wider service, on the organisation, on the sector itself. Are you the sort of person that's going to cast a shadow or cast a shine over your organisation? We go through some great definitions of leadership, talk about how to think moving into those new roles. We speak about a 100-day plan. We speak about psychological contracts, spoken and unspoken. We speak about the challenges we have with the agility or lack thereof in our organizations and how we respond to some of the changes. We also talk about the challenges faced in mental health, and not perhaps from the generic standpoint that you've probably heard before. So there is a lot to take away from today's conversation. And it's a real privilege to be able to be part of this passing of the torch, changing of the guard, being able to pay forward all of these experiences so that you don't have to relive them all yourself. You can learn the lesson before you take the test, because we are living in testing times at the moment. We don't have the answers for everything. And even where we do have the answers, perhaps we don't have the funding. But there is still movement, there's still wiggle room, and there's certainly a lot of desire and passion to try and continue moving the needle, making our services happier, healthier, more effective. And if you adopt some of the things that Carl shares with us today, I sincerely believe there are some tactical, deployable, personal development themes that you can take away from this conversation. So without further ado, it's a privilege to introduce today's guest, Carl Boasman. I'll see you on the other side.
One of the greatest sort of journeys any leader goes on, particularly when you move from a firefighter to supervisory to middle to strategic, is you learn that span of control, if we were to sort of align it to an incident command situation, it gets bigger. And I think, if I think back to when certainly I became a leading firefighter for the first time back in the early 90s, and then a sub-officer, and then a station officer and station manager, and you suddenly go from thinking about what you're going to be doing next tour on a watch, and then when you become in charge of a district, a station, you start thinking about what's going to happen that quarter and then that year, and then as you start to progress up to group and area, it suddenly becomes next year's financial planning, and then when you become a strategic leader, brigade manager, you're thinking about the medium-term financial plan in the next 10 years. And I think Something that I've seen other people do a lot is wearing being busy as a badge of honour, and I think it's very seductive to think that you can be all things to all people. You know, there's something about solving everybody's problems. There's something about being the go-to person, and I think that feeds a need in the human being to sort of feel valued, but it really is something that really is only feeding your own ego, I think, at the end of the day. And we all have an ego, you know, there's nothing wrong with it, and we all have different kind of ego states, and you know, different times of the day, year, whatever, you know, we all have different, you know, that ego state is different. But I think for me, you know, the thing that sort of the big learning thing is you can't be everywhere, do everything, you know, be all things to all people all of the time. And I think that the big learning thing for me, and it never really disappointed me, was just having that confidence and faith in your team. And you said something earlier there, Pete, around, you know, what happens when I'm not there. And, you know, there is a real pressure, particularly when you get into those strategic roles, that your day job is so busy and you have an awful lot of things spinning, a lot of plates spinning. That's just in the day job before you even throw in a spontaneous operational incident. But also as well, the thing that so you remind yourself on a daily basis is that you have some very competent people, and some people that would benefit from feeling some of that pressure, for, you know, being exposed to various, and also, you know, trusting people and allowing people the space to make a mistake, because it is that thing around, not everybody will do everything the way that you want them to do. You know, again, it's that thing about just learning that, you know, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good. Do you want to cast a shine on the organisation, or do you want to cast a shadow on the organisation? And it's often referred to as the shadow you cast, and it gets bigger and bigger as you go through an organisation, and the decisions that you make and the impact that you can have on that organisation becomes massive, and ultimately that ends up in people's lives or experience when they come to work, the services that you provide for the community. I used to go and speak to the initial command courses as they were coming through and talk to them about decision making, talk to them about leadership, and one of the questions I would ask them would be to define leadership. And it sounds easy. It's well, what is? Can you just explain leadership to me? And I had some really great responses. One of the best definitions of leadership that I heard was on my ELP, and there's two that I love, and I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to share them. So the first one is leadership is about disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. And I remember the first time I heard that, and I thought, that's my job, that's what I have to do. And of course, it's not always good news, and I don't know who that's attributed to. I can't give you I'm afraid it wasn't me. Oh, that's all I'll say. And the second one is consistently doing the right thing despite fatigue, personal pressure, jeopardy, and risk to yourself. And I think, depending on what day you ask me, they're my sort of preferred definitions of leadership, because I think people look at leadership generally through a very positive lens, and naturally I think we should. You know, leadership is about inspiring people, it's about motivating, it's supporting, but sometimes it's also about putting boundaries in, and also about sometimes you have to say no, and sometimes that you have to give people news that they don't want to hear. And for me, it's always comes down to intent, and I think if you're going to spend time with a team, group of people, it's about what's your intent with that, what do you want to achieve out of that, and sometimes it's to go and deliver some information, and to give people an update. And if it was bad news, if it was, you know, it was not about pleasing the room. I've seen people go and do the visits and they would probably say anything that you know, to get themselves safely out the room and disappear off. And I think that leads to credibility issues with those types of individuals. I have seen people, so I've certainly not wanted to follow that. I think the ones where I've seen the most engagement has been a couple of things. One is that you must be prepared for people to tell you what they need to tell you, how they need to tell you. So don't get prickly about if somebody comes at you with, if they're appearing a little abrasive, a little bit, chewy, a little bit. As a leader, if you're going to go and talk to your teams, park your ego outside, and if people want to tell you something, doesn't matter how it's packaged up, just let them tell you. Now, provided you're not rude, I've said people, I'm not going to be rude to you, don't be rude to me. But generally speaking, I would take that as people have got standards and they care. Many discussions with teams about what is a culture? Can you tell me what a culture is? And it's really interesting to hear people's take on what a culture is, and it kind of boils down to kind of the way things are done around here. And there's always an element of fitting in with a culture. There's always an element of sort of in groups and out groups and all that sort of stuff. But that's just human nature. That's human psychology. But I think for me, culture is something, the fire service culture, if we were to look at that as is something to be proud of. And I think there are many positive attributes to the fire service culture, many traditions within the fire and rescue service that we should be proud of, and I don't think we should shy away from that at all. I think where a culture becomes difficult is where it has, if a culture has a detrimental effect on individuals, groups, or the organisation, then it becomes an issue. But I think it comes down to, in many cases, particularly within the fire service, the leadership of that group, the influencers within that group. And when I say leadership, I don't mean the defined leaders or the assigned leaders. I think some of the most influential people that I've ever worked with have not held any assigned managerial role at all. They've been, people that have been, just part of the group, but actually are really influential people, for the better or for the worse. But I think it always comes back to human nature being what it is. But for me, leadership plays a huge part in culture within any team, and boundaries as well. There are times when I've seen leaders put boundaries in where they've needed to be put in, and I've taken something from that to think, wow, you've stood up for somebody when they weren't in the room. And I really have a lot of respect for that. But I've also seen leaders that haven't stood up for people when they've been in the room and not been in the room. And again, that sort of has led for my respect for them to evaporate slightly. I would like to just pay tribute to our colleague that we lost, a fine man who is sadly missed and will be sadly missed for a long time. I knew our colleague reasonably well, did some national work with him, and without doubt one of his great qualities was wherever you saw him, wherever you met him, you spoke to him and he made you feel important. I've experienced it myself. I've seen him do it, and I just didn't want to not pay a bit of tribute to his memory. A wonderful man who will be sadly missed. Had a huge influence on the sector and will continue to do so. And I think if you saw social media after the sad news broke, I think anybody will get an idea of how well respected. So to his memory, just to pause there for a moment, if you don't mind. And I think in 1 year, I had a significant amount of trauma, road deaths, several incidents involving people that had been sadly killed by drink drivers, some involving children. There was a fire fatality in there as well, and I think I counted up about 14 fatalities in a 12-month period. And it just seemed like every time my pager at the time went off and I was going out, so I could be sat at home, at night, 7 o'clock at night, when I was in the middle of, I could be in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the supermarket and a Saturday afternoon, and I'd get mobilised, and literally within 10 to 15 minutes you would be within the scene of to devastation and carnage. One was where I was on call from home Saturday afternoon. I went to a fatal road accident, sadly with a young child involved, and I was decorating my youngest son's bedroom at the time. He was just about to arrive, and I remember just walking back into the house and just thinking, and what I realised was, over time I'd been starting to make some links to my personal circumstances around becoming a parent for the first time, the vulnerability of your children, and the sort of incident that really sort of made me realise that I couldn't really go on experiencing that level of trauma was sadly when a colleague took his own life at the fire station. And I can remember going to the station with the crew, and we worked on him, trying to keep him alive, and sadly I brought the news to his family, and remember just standing there, seeing the impact that had on them. And again, going home that day, that night, that morning, and I remember just thinking, my way of thinking has now completely and utterly changed about how I see the world. I went in, we just got back from another job, I think it was about 1 a.m. And so we were up and about, and it was a car in the water at a local beauty spot, and this car had entered the water. One person had escaped and raised the alarm, and we were pretty much out the doors within, pretty much before the bells had finished, and we were on our way. And the information that we were getting back was that the car had only just gone in the water. It was February, very cold, and of course you're already thinking about chances of survival, etc. And I remember sort of running down to the riverbank and seeing the car under the water. It's about 10 foot under the water. I could see the lights were on, and there was a young man there sort of screaming out as his friends were trapped in the vehicle. And what had been happening is he'd been sort of riding around on the roof of the car, reportedly, and then they'd gone into the water, and literally this must have happened within about 4 or 5 minutes of us arriving. So naturally the question that comes through your mind is, are those young men alive? Are they breathing their last? And I remember the police officer turning to me and saying, "Can you do anything?" And it was myself and another firefighter who was actually an open water swimmer. He was an open water triathlete, actually, was this guy. Really fit, really competent in the water. Without really saying too much to each other, we just went back up to the pump, got 2 BA sets, took our fire kit off, and we attached a line to ourselves, started our breathing apparatus sets up, and we entered the water. There had been some previous tragedies involving, I think it was a sub-officer in Merseyside or Manchester, where somebody sadly lost their life within the last 12 months. We were quite aware of the risk, but the pressure we felt, and sometimes you've got to put yourself in harm's way to do something, and the thought of those young men being under there spurred us on. I've got to say, it was a reasonably fast flowing river. We tried everything. Long story short, we made several attempts to try and get down to the vehicle. At one point I had my hand on the door handle, but just due to the water pressure, the cold, our face masks were filling up with water. And I've got to say, without being too dramatic, I think it's the closest I've ever come to being in serious danger in the job. If in any way anything that we've discussed sort of inspires people to be the best they can be in the job at whatever level that may be, either to develop themselves through the roles, or to stay at whatever level they, I've worked with people, some fantastic people. I learned my trade from some fantastic firefighters who were firefighters all their career. I have the utmost respect for that. Whatever level you want to be at in the fire and rescue service, be the best you can. And I think for me, just do not forget the difference that you make to people's lives every day. And I'll go back to the point I made around, every day there are people that do some very compassionate, very courageous, very professional things day in, day out that will have an impact on people's lives for the better. And I think it's an absolute privilege to be able to do that. And whatever challenges are thrown at the fire sector, and I'm sure there will be many over the coming years, just keep that sense of perspective around that, be proud to be part of the UK Fire and Rescue Service, because it really is something to be proud of.
The Firefighters podcast was created to recognise, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our drive and purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents that get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're around the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.